The upper slopes of Mount Everest in winter are a landscape of extremes. Snow stretches uninterrupted in every direction, shifting in patterns sculpted by the wind. Above the Khumbu icefall, jagged seracs rise like frozen towers, their blue shadows moving slowly as sunlight shifts across the ridge. The air is thin and dry, carrying no scent but the faint metallic tang of ice. Temperatures routinely fall below 30 degrees Celsius, and the gusts can reach speeds capable of knocking a person off their feet. Silence dominates the high-altitude environment. The mountain absorbs sound, leaving only the faint whisper of snow against rock and the occasional snap of ice. Crevasses gape along the glacier, invisible beneath wind-driven snow. From a distance, the summit appears calm, even inviting, yet every contour conceals a risk. The geography imposes isolation. Climbers ascend through narrow ridges, navigating steep slopes where a single misstep can be fatal. Base camps are hours, sometimes days away. Above Camp 4, in the so-called death zone, oxygen levels are less than a third of what is available at sea level. Movement is slow, deliberate, measured. Even minor exertion can induce breathlessness, and small mistakes carry consequences. During the winter months, storms form quickly, sweeping across the northern slopes from Tibet or rolling up from Nepal. Clouds gather with little warning, transforming the landscape into a white void. In these conditions, the mountain is both still and unforgiving, a place where human presence is fragile. It is here, among the silent heights, that the climber in this story began a journey without immediate danger. The wind shaped the snow, the peaks remained distant and indifferent, and the day unfolded quietly. The mountain's scale, the isolation, and the altitude set the stage for the events that would follow. The climber at the center of this account was David Sharp, a British mountaineer in his early 30s with a history of high-altitude expeditions. Born and raised in London, Sharp had developed a methodical approach to climbing over several years, gaining experience in the Alps, the Andes, and the Himalayas. His record included ascents of peaks above 6,000 meters, often in winter or early spring conditions, providing him with knowledge of both technical climbing and the physiological effects of altitude. Sharp's objective was clear. He aimed to reach the summit of Mount Everest via the North Ridge in May 2006. He joined a small team of climbers from various countries who were attempting the ascent without supplemental support beyond oxygen tanks. The group's approach was minimalistic, prioritizing speed and self-sufficiency over large-scale logistical support. Unlike commercial expeditions that place fixed ropes and maintain constant communication, this team relied on personal planning, prior reconnaissance, and the climber's own judgment. Prior to the Everest expedition, Sharp had prepared extensively, underwent physical conditioning focused on cardiovascular endurance, strength for climbing and hauling gear, and techniques for navigating icy slopes. He also trained in survival strategies for extreme cold, including the use of layered clothing, snow shelters, and limited oxygen protocols. His experience with frostbite, hypoxia, and altitude sickness was limited but informed by previous Himalayan treks. The climb began from the Tibetan side, with the North Base Camp situated at approximately 5,150 meters. From there, climbers typically advance through several high camps before attempting the summit. Each stage requires acclimatization, careful assessment of weather windows, and strict adherence to oxygen management. The North Ridge route, while less crowded than the southern approach from Nepal, presents steep ridges, narrow paths, and exposure to sudden storms. Sharp's motivation was personal and procedural rather than competitive. He sought the accomplishment of reaching the summit under his own capabilities, aware of the risks inherent in the death zone. The expedition organizers were experienced mountaineers themselves, but had limited capacity to supervise every climber closely due to the dispersed nature of the route and the reliance on individual pace. Decisions regarding timing, rest, and oxygen usage were left largely to the climbers themselves. By the third week of May, the team had reached Camp 4 at roughly 8,300 meters. The conditions were within the expected range for the season. Sub-zero temperatures, wind speeds averaging 50 to 60 kilometers per hour, and intermittent cloud cover. Sharp's body had begun the slow adaptation to extreme altitude, and his team had discussed summit plans over several days. Despite minor fatigue and early signs of mild frostbite in some members, the group was prepared to make a final push. The framework for survival at this stage depended on careful pacing, knowledge of the route, and maintaining clear-headed judgment. Sharp had all standard equipment: insulated clothing, climbing harness, helmet, ropes, ice axes, crampons, and oxygen tanks with regulators. The combination of personal skill, preparation, and the structured plan of ascent provided a basis for expectation of safety, even in an environment that allowed for no margin of error. Yet, as the climbers prepared for the summit attempt, conditions on the mountain were shifting. The storm systems in the region were unpredictable, and the thin atmosphere amplified every gust of wind, every drop in temperature. Within this environment, decisions made in the next hours would define survival. On the morning of May 14, 2006, David Sharp left Camp 4 with the intention of reaching Everest's summit via the North Ridge. The sky was partially clear, but thin clouds hovered along the higher ridges. Temperatures remained below 25 degrees Celsius, and the wind, though moderate at first, carried a persistent chill that sapped energy more quickly than anticipated. Oxygen bottles were fitted, crampons secured, and ice axes in hand. The ascent began in a measured pace, each step deliberate on the icy slope. By mid-morning, the mountain's conditions had subtly shifted. Clouds thickened, reducing visibility, and gusts of wind increased along the ridge. Sharp continued alone for periods, as climbers often do at high altitudes, to maintain individual pacing. This isolation, common in high-altitude climbing, meant that immediate assistance in case of trouble was unavailable. Sharp was reported to have been slower than other summit contenders due to fatigue and the effects of prolonged oxygen deprivation. At approximately 8,600 meters, climbers later noted, Sharp had stopped moving for an extended period. The reason for the pause is not precisely documented, though it likely involved exhaustion and the physiological strain of the death zone, where oxygen levels are insufficient to sustain normal body function for extended periods. At this altitude, even minor miscalculations can prevent the ability to descend safely. The team ahead, observing the onset of worsening weather and their own diminishing oxygen, continued toward the summit, leaving Sharp behind. Within hours, a blizzard enveloped the upper slopes. Visibility dropped to near zero. Temperatures plummeted further, and the mountain became a featureless expanse of snow and ice. The moment of isolation was absolute. Sharp was alone in a high-altitude environment where movement, even with experience and equipment, was severely restricted. This was the point of no return. Sharp's survival depended entirely on his ability to endure the elements, manage limited resources, and navigate the treacherous slope without assistance. At this stage, the mountain had ceased to be merely a challenge. It became an environment indifferent to human life, and every decision or lack of action carried immediate consequences. Above 8,600 meters, the region known as the death zone begins. At this altitude, the human body cannot acclimatize fully. Oxygen saturation in the blood remains critically low, and any exertion accelerates physiological decline. David Sharp, left alone on Mount Everest during a sudden blizzard, faced precisely this environment. The mountain around him was quiet, white, and featureless. Winds moved snow into drifts, forming temporary barriers, while the ridge itself was narrow and exposed. Every step required extreme care, as a misplacement of crampon or ice axe could result in a fall of hundreds of meters. Sharp's immediate challenge was to maintain body temperature and conserve energy. Historical accounts indicate that he remained in a single position for extended periods, often crouched against the wind, attempting to shield himself with the limited equipment at his disposal. He had with him a small backpack containing oxygen bottles, insulated clothing, and minimal supplies. The blizzard prevented easy movement or access to pre-planned caches, and the snowdrifts made navigation nearly impossible. Shelter, in its most rudimentary form, became essential. Sharp used his own body and gear to create a windbreak, leaning against a snow wall and using the backpack and oxygen cylinders to reduce exposure. At these altitudes, even the simplest shelter can mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. Without a tent or other climbers nearby, Sharp's strategies relied entirely on his knowledge of mountaineering principles, minimizing surface contact with snow, reducing wind exposure, and conserving energy for small, deliberate movements. Oxygen management was critical. Sharp carried supplemental oxygen, but use was limited by the finite supply. Historical data indicates that he likely rationed oxygen carefully, turning off regulators during periods of rest. The cold itself reduced the efficiency of the bottles, and regulators could freeze, making careful timing essential. Each inhalation was measured, each breath a consideration of immediate survival and the longer-term goal of descent. Hydration posed another challenge. At extreme altitude, dehydration occurs rapidly due to respiratory water loss, increased urination from cold diuresis, and minimal access to liquid water. Sharp had limited fluid reserves. Historical reports suggest that he may have melted snow for minimal intake, a process made slow and dangerous by the cold and wind. Eating was nearly impossible. The human body at such altitudes requires significant calories for thermoregulation, yet appetite diminishes, and digesting even small amounts of food can be physically taxing. The blizzard's presence extended for hours. Sharp's perception of time was compromised by hypoxia, exhaustion, and the whiteout conditions. Movement became intermittent, dictated by gusts of wind or sudden shifts in visibility. Even small distances required careful assessment of snow stability and ridge exposure. Historical accounts from other climbers indicate that, at this stage, climbers may enter a semi-conscious state, functioning largely on instinct and experience. Sharp's continued survival demonstrates a degree of self-regulation and awareness that is rare in such conditions. During the blizzard, Sharp employed techniques common to high-altitude survival, but rarely observed outside extreme mountaineering literature. He rested in a crouched position to reduce the surface area exposed to the wind, tucked extremities under the body, and adjusted layers of clothing to retain heat. Frostbite had likely begun to develop in fingers and toes, as is typical above 8,500 meters. Historical reports confirm that individuals in similar circumstances often suffer irreversible tissue damage even when survival is achieved. Navigation was constrained. With the storm reducing visibility to near zero, Sharp relied on the immediate ridge and prior knowledge of the terrain. The human body's physiological responses to altitude dizziness, impaired judgment, and slowed reaction time further complicated attempts at movement. The mountain itself offered no markers. Snowdrifts covered any footprints or rocks that could serve as guides. In these conditions, minor errors could have fatal consequences. Psychological endurance was as vital as physical. At this stage, historical analysis of high-altitude climbers shows that the ability to remain calm, assess risks rationally, and execute small tasks is a determining factor in survival. Sharp faced profound isolation, limited oxygen, extreme cold, and the continuous threat of collapse. There are no records of verbalized thoughts or communications. What is documented is behavior. He continued to adjust clothing, ration oxygen, and maintain position on the ridge, demonstrating the disciplined adherence to survival principles. Environmental hazards persisted. Winds fluctuated in force, sometimes exceeding 80 kilometers per hour. Snow accumulated quickly, forming unstable drifts over crevasses. The mountain's surface shifted under Sharp's weight, forcing constant attention to footing. Hypothermia risk remained high, with core temperature dropping gradually, despite insulation. The combination of wind chill and physical inactivity could have been fatal within hours. As the day progressed, Sharp's condition likely fluctuated. Historical studies of climbers in the death zone indicate episodes of microsleep, temporary disorientation, and slowed motor function. He maintained minimal movement, conserving energy, and periodically assessing whether he could continue toward lower camps or if he needed to remain sheltered until conditions eased. During the night, temperatures fell further. Sharp's body faced the additional challenge of conserving heat without movement. Insulating layers, windbreaks, and partial use of the oxygen system were the only means to maintain a survivable core temperature. While most climbers would be incapacitated, Sharp's documented survival suggests he endured in this state for extended periods, maintaining enough cognitive and physical function to continue the next day. The following morning, the blizzard had partially abated, revealing the ridge and the faint tracks of climbers who had passed. Sharp continued to maintain position, attempting incremental progress toward Camp 4. Historical accounts from fellow climbers indicate that he remained largely immobile, relying on situational awareness and careful adjustment of clothing and gear to endure. Even minimal movement required careful assessment of snow stability and ridge exposure. Over the course of several hours, Sharp's actions exemplified systematic survival. His survival was not a result of chance or dramatic feats. It was the methodical application of high-altitude principles under conditions that routinely proved fatal. He remained conscious of oxygen supply, body heat, and exposure, taking measured steps toward potential rescue while conserving resources. Throughout this period, Sharp's survival depended entirely on the intersection of preparation, experience, and the mountain's brief lulls in severe weather. Each hour passed without incident increased the probability of continuation. Each misstep could have ended it. The death zone imposed a strict regime: conserve energy, avoid exposure, manage oxygen, maintain awareness. Historical documentation confirms that individuals in similar circumstances either adhered to these principles or succumbed. Sharp's endurance continued through multiple cycles of weather fluctuation, minimal rest, and limited nourishment. He remained on the North Ridge in conditions that exceeded standard operational limits for human physiology. Every action was deliberate. Every inaction, a strategy. The surrounding mountain remained indifferent, a constant presence of ice, wind, and altitude. This prolonged, systematic approach to survival defined the hours that followed the point of isolation. Sharp did not move quickly. He did not attempt bold maneuvers. Instead, he applied incremental, documented survival techniques under extreme conditions. It was this disciplined methodology that allowed him to persist in an environment where survival is statistically improbable, demonstrating the limits of human endurance in one of the harshest settings on Earth. As the hours turned into a full day, the consequences of prolonged exposure became evident. At altitudes above 8,600 meters, the human body cannot sustain normal function for long periods. Oxygen deprivation, extreme cold, and exhaustion converged. David Sharp, despite his careful management of resources, experienced the physiological decline typical of climbers in the death zone. Reports indicate severe frostbite on fingers and toes, as is common at these elevations. Muscles stiffened, movements slowed, and coordination diminished. Sleep became irregular, punctuated by microsleeps induced by hypoxia. These brief episodes, lasting seconds or minutes, are well documented among high-altitude mountaineers, often occurring while upright or in precarious positions. Sharp's ability to maintain position on the ridge, adjust clothing, and manage his oxygen depended on minimal awareness and the strength of learned routines. Even minor lapses could have resulted in catastrophic loss of balance. Dehydration and caloric depletion compounded physical strain. Melting snow for water required energy and precise attention to wind conditions. Eating was largely impossible, as the body's appetite diminishes and digestion becomes inefficient above 8,500 meters. The result was gradual weakening of the body's core temperature regulation and reduced muscular function. These effects, while incremental, carried critical consequences. Environmental conditions continued to fluctuate. Winds occasionally gusted to 70 to 80 kilometers per hour, shifting snowdrifts and reducing visibility to near zero. Temperature drops, combined with the body's exhaustion, increased the risk of hypothermia. Sharp's oxygen supply was decreasing. Each inhalation became a choice between conserving resources and sustaining minimal function for potential descent. Psychological stress intensified, though documentation is limited to observable behavior. High-altitude climbers often experience time distortion, impaired judgment, and a narrowing of attention to immediate survival tasks. Sharp's recorded actions adjusting layers, maintaining position, and monitoring oxygen reflect focus on the fundamental requirements for survival. He did not attempt excessive movement or risk exposure beyond what was necessary. Attempts at descent or rescue were constrained. Other climbers had proceeded to the summit or returned to lower camps due to the storm and the practical limitations of high-altitude climbing. Sharp was isolated in an environment where even experienced teams cannot provide immediate assistance. The mountain remained indifferent to human presence. The blizzard and thin air compounded every difficulty. Sharp's survival became a balance of endurance and cautious action. Each hour passed with gradual physical decline, punctuated by environmental hazards and limited opportunity for recovery. Frostbite advanced, energy reserves dwindled, and oxygen supply diminished further. Yet he persisted, a methodical adherence to documented survival techniques, allowing him to withstand conditions that often prove fatal to more robust or better equipped climbers. By the end of this period, Sharp's body had reached the threshold of extreme physiological stress. Movement was minimal, reaction time slow, and perception impaired. Despite this, careful application of high-altitude survival principles, wind avoidance, energy conservation, oxygen management out, continued persistence. The mountain's environment, relentless and indifferent, continued to shape each decision, defining the boundary between life and death. By the following morning, conditions on the North Ridge had partially stabilized. The blizzard that had enveloped the upper slopes of Everest began to lessen, though temperatures remained below 30 degrees Celsius and wind gusts persisted. Visibility improved slightly, revealing the ridge in the uneven expanse of snow and ice. David Sharp, still at the same approximate location, continued to maintain position using the limited resources at his disposal. Around mid-morning, other climbers descending from the summit noticed his presence. Accounts from fellow mountaineers indicate that Sharp appeared motionless at first, partially shielded by his backpack and equipment. Given the extreme altitude, immediate assistance was difficult. The descending climbers had already experienced significant exhaustion themselves, limiting the speed and extent of help they could provide. Nevertheless, they attempted to assess his condition and make arrangements for aid. Oxygen was administered, and clothing adjustments were made to reduce wind exposure. Sharp was unable to move significantly on his own, demonstrating the cumulative effects of frostbite, hypoxia, and prolonged exposure. The descending climbers stabilized him as best they could within the constraints of the environment. Rescue required coordination and a gradual approach given the narrow ridges and the continued presence of ice hazards. Over the course of several hours, Sharp was assisted in small, incremental movements toward lower terrain. Each step was deliberate and required support, both for balance and safety. Oxygen supply was supplemented, and he was positioned in ways that minimized further exposure to wind and cold. These measures were informed by high-altitude survival protocols, emphasizing slow, careful action over speed. Eventually, Sharp was able to reach a temporary location near Camp 4, where he received further aid. Medical evaluation confirmed severe frostbite to fingers and toes, moderate hypothermia, and exhaustion. Despite these conditions, his vital signs remained stable, and the systematic approach to survival he had maintained allowed him to endure until external assistance could be provided. The situation did not include dramatic celebration or expressions of relief. The environment remained harsh, and the presence of other climbers was a pragmatic necessity rather than a narrative climax. Sharp's survival was recorded as a result of careful preparation, knowledge of high-altitude techniques, and disciplined adherence to survival principles under extreme conditions. The quiet resolution underscores the fragility of human life at extreme altitude. The mountain's indifferent environment had shaped every moment of Sharp's survival. Rescue was achieved not through heroics, but through methodical, deliberate actions, combined with the endurance and resourcefulness the climber had applied throughout the ordeal. David Sharp's survival on Mount Everest remains a documented example of endurance at the limits of human capability. The incident illustrates the extreme conditions of the death zone, where preparation, knowledge, and disciplined action determine life or death. Beyond the personal story, it highlights the broader realities of high-altitude climbing, the indifference of the environment, the limits of physiology, and the careful, methodical measures necessary to endure where few survive.